Hi everybody. Today we are going to review and analyze a very popular video on the website Crash Course, in particular Mr. Green's Crash Course on Capitalism and Socialism. It is a 9-minute video. It has gotten 10 million views, so I think it deserves our attention because it is not that bad, but it has a few key misconceptions about capitalism that I see very often perpetuated both in colloquial culture and also in the mainstream and even in education. So people go to the voting booth and cast their votes for capitalism or socialism, not knowing major issues regarding both. So with that, let's get rolling.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course World History, and today we're going to talk about capitalism. Yeah, Mr. Green. Capitalism just turns men into wolves. Your purportedly free markets only make slaves of us all. Oh God, Stan, it's me from college. Me from the past has become me from college. This is a disaster. The reason he's so unbearable, Stan, is that he refuses to recognize the legitimacy of other people's narratives, and that means that he will never, ever be able to have a productive conversation with another human in his entire life. So listen, me from the past, I'm going to disappoint you by being too capitalist, and I'm going to disappoint a lot of other people by not being capitalist enough, and I'm going to disappoint the historians by not using enough jargon. But what can I do? We only have 12 minutes. Fortunately, capitalism is all about efficiency, so let's do this, me from college.
So I'm not going to be skipping parts of his video because I want to give it good. It would be a disservice if I try to cut too much. So here we had to go through some comedic skits here and there, which are just part of the course. But first, as he mentions here just in passing, capitalism is all about efficiency. That is what efficiency is a byproduct of capitalism. And yes, capitalism maximizes efficiency, but there is more to that. It is the ability for us, the participants in the society, to choose how to use our own capital, broadly defined: money, time, effort, health, education, expertise, in the way as we see fit, as opposed to dictated by others. And the result, maximum efficiency when feasible, can be approached, but that's the byproduct. Not that capitalism is all about that.
Randy Riggs becomes a best-selling author. Josh Radnor stars in a great sitcom. It is not going to work out with Emily, and do not go to Alaska with a girl you've known for...
And also, when we talk about capitalism is all about efficiency, in history we have seen how big parts of the world got uplifted from complete poverty to cell phones only after the products of capitalism reach them. But I very rarely see capitalism is all about eliminating poverty, even though it is seems to be, for the time being, the most successful system that has managed to do so.
For 10 days. Okay, let's talk capitalism. So capitalism is an economic system, but it's also a cultural system. It's characterized by innovation and investment to increase wealth. But today we're going to focus on production and how industrial capitalism changed it. Stan, I can't wear these emblems of the bourgeoisie.
Although, just to keep in mind, market forces apply all the time, just like gravity. And we saw explosion of productivity when industrialization came about. But let's keep closely in mind that capitalism and industrialization are not the same thing. And we should not always think about the workers of the 18th century as an example of what capitalism is about. This is just one of the many elements.
Well, Karl Marx himself is looking at me. It's ridiculous. I'm changing.
Okay, to be nice.
Very hard to take off a shirt dramatically. So let's say it's 1200 CE and you're a rug merchant. Just like merchants today, you sometimes need to borrow money in order to buy the rugs you want to resell at a profit, and then you pay that money back, often with interest, once you've resold the rugs. This is called mercantile capitalism, and it was a global phenomenon, from the Chinese to the Indian Ocean Trade Network to Muslim merchants who would sponsor trade caravans across the Sahara. But by the 17th century, merchants in the Netherlands and in Britain had expanded upon this idea to create joint stock companies. Those companies could finance bigger trade missions and also spread the risk of international trade. But
this is actually very important. It is correct. Spreading the risk so that you do not get wiped out financially when you try to get rich by providing value to others. Because let's remember, how do we make money in capitalism? others need to give us money. And why do they give us money? Only if they value what we offer greater than what they value the money for. So we must be useful to others so that others voluntarily pay us back. And the more people get economically involved, whether through labor or through investment or through the combination of both, the more wealth is generated that will go for everybody.
The thing about international trade is sometimes boats sink or they get taken by pirates. And while that's bad if you're a sailor because, you lose your life, it's really bad if you're a mercantile capitalist because you lost all your money. But if you own...
This is really uncalled for and an interesting jab that has no place here. Two issues. Issue number one, it implies that dying on the job is somehow a byproduct of capitalism. It is very important to keep in mind when we analyze social systems and we want to criticize them for something, we have to see whether that something is truly depending on that social system or whether it can be found all over the place. So let's say dying on the job. During hunter-gathering society, could one die on the job? Absolutely. During slavery, could somebody die on the job? Absolutely. During feudalism, could somebody die on the job, whether taking care of animals or building bridges or getting raided by somebody from the nearby barony? Sure. Could you die on the job during capitalism? Sure. Could you die during the job under socialism? Let me tell you, yes, you could. So any activity involves, there were a lot of activities that involve the risk of death, and they do not depend on the socioeconomic order. So that's the first problem with that kind of uncalled for jab at capitalism. The second one is that the logic is just, it's a fallacy. In the same way, you can say if you order Uber and the Uber driver who is going to come to your address runs the risk of getting into a car accident and using their life. So what he would say here, oh, imagine how terrible is your car doesn't arrive on time and you lose 15 minutes. That's nothing compared to the Uber driver who just lost their life. So you see, it is an intellectual sleight of hand, and even though, and actually what's worse, it gets passed here only into a 5-second segment so that people hear it. It makes an imprint on their mind without having the chance to think it through. But as we see, it is problematic, and don't allow your opponents in a discussion to come up with jobs like that and move on scoring a point on you.
1/10 of 10 boats, your risk is much better managed. That kind of investment definitely increased wealth, but it only affected a sliver of the population, and it didn't create a...
Interestingly, so wealth, why do people generate wealth? In order to use it for other things. How do you use wealth for other things? You trade with others. So it is impossible the wealth to affect only a sliver of the population, regardless of how tempting and how moral groundy that thing may sound.
A culture of capitalism. Industrial capitalism was something altogether different, both in scale and in practice. Let's use Joyce Appleby's definition of industrial capitalism. An economic system that relies on investment of capital in machines and technology that are used to increase production of marketable goods. So imagine that someone made a stand machine by...
We could define it better, but okay, let's go with him for a while.
By the way, Stan, this is a remarkable likeness. And that stand machine could produce and direct 10 times more episodes of Crash Course than a human stand. Well, of course, even if there are significant upfront costs, I'm going to invest in a stand machine so I can start cranking out 10 times the knowledge.
Cost.
Stan, are you focusing on the robot instead of me? I am the star of the show! Stan, but you're going behind the globe. So when most of us think about capitalism, especially when we think about its downsides, long hours, low wages, miserable working conditions...
Interestingly, as if in the pre-existing social orders we didn't have long hours. Think about farming before machinery that came as a result of invention, which came as a result of people finding as a result of people hoping that they will get paid and get rich by coming up with those inventions.
Conditions, child labor, unemployed...
Child labor. That's one of my favorite lies when it comes to trying to depict capitalism. Do we have record of children working under capitalism, especially in the early stages? Sure, but what we conveniently omit is that child labor was just as prevalent in all prior social systems. In farming, children were helping, and those who didn't help in farming would often be assigned from age as early as 7 to work with shoemakers, tailors, and other people who were used in the manufacturing process back then, which was mostly by hand. This is a manufacturing. And we had the apprentice, then the journeyman, all the way to master. And these things happened, well known in Europe, and I suspect in other places probably as well, where if there was labor to be done, everyone got involved by whatever means they could. And little kids, they did not partake in hard physical labor, but there weren't that many idle children. You were either picking crops, you were with the goats, or you were assisting the older men with larger livestock. You were picking eggs, you were gathering berries, or you were assigned to a group who was working under a master craftsman, and you were learning the craft that would take many years. And that started often from a very early age. And there are people who are still alive today who can tell you stories how their grandparent, usually the male grandparent, was as a child sent to work and live in the group of master craftsmen. So to point child labor as just something pertinent to capitalism alone is false. Children worked in all prior social orders when there was a need of labor. And only once capitalism produced the wealth that society had, so that now labor is not as critically needed as it was in the past. Therefore, we can alleviate the burden of labor from, we can remove the requirement of labor from some segments of the society, in particular here, the children. But this is a very new phenomenon. And actually, it's kind of interesting to blame the system that solved the issue for actually the issue existing, while that issue existed throughout human history.
Stands, that's what we're thinking about. Now, admittedly, this is just one definition of industrial capitalism among many, but it's the definition we're going with. All right, let's go to the thought bubble. Industrial capitalism developed first in Britain in the 19th century. Britain had a bunch of advantages. It was the dominant power on the seas, and it was making good money off of trade with its colonies, including the slave trade. Also, the growth of
Another thing, slave trade existed as long as slaves existed, and slave existed as we know historically for at least several thousand years. But how conveniently we have to mention slave trade when it came to capitalism. Now, of course, we're not going to throw a jab at more, quote, advanced system like socialism or communism, which could be presented as being delocalized slavery, where the government owns the entire population and just puts you on one place or another.
Capitalism was helped by the half-century of civil unrest that resulted from the 17th century English Civil War. Now, I'm not advocating for civil wars or anything, but in this particular case, it was useful because before the war, the British Crown had put a lot of regulations on the economy, complicated licenses, royal monopolies, etc. But during the turmoil, it couldn't enforce them, which made for freer markets. Another factor was a remarkable increase in agricultural.
A speck of truth in all that slew of statements. Yes, sometimes when the bureaucrats are not capable of suppressing human activity, actually people find ways to take better care of themselves, just like we had in the early years of the United States, and now the time period here that he describes. For a moment, the boot was off of the neck of the productive people, and as a result, wealth got generated.
productivity in the 16th century. As food prices started to rise, it became profitable for farmers, both large and small, to invest in agricultural technologies that would improve crop yields. Those higher prices for grain probably resulted from population growth, which in turn was encouraged by increased production of food crops. A number of these agricultural improvements came from the Dutch, who had chronic problems feeding themselves and discovered that planting different kinds of crops, like clover, that added nitrogen to the soil and could be used to feed.
So just to agree here, so once you allow people to start taking care of themselves and find solutions for their problems, especially when they expect to get paid, the way it happens in capitalism, again, others pay you for what you offer to them, societies find ways to solve their problems.
Feed livestock at the same time meant that more fields could be used at once. This increased productivity eventually brought down prices, and this encouraged further innovation in order to increase yield to make up for the drop in prices. Lower food prices had an added benefit. Since food cost less and wages in England remained high, workers would have more disposable income, which meant that if there were consumer goods available, they would be consumed, which incentivized people to make consumer goods more efficiently and therefore more cheaply. You can see how this positive feedback loop leads to more food and more stuff, culminating in
in fraction. The wealthier a society is, the more choices the members of that society have. And to present is just of access to stuff, that reminds me like the story of stuff of another very manipulative video which this channel already has commentary on.
In a world where people have so much stuff that we must rent space to store it, and so much food that obesity has become a bigger killer than.
The problem is not the food, it is the choice. And that's the thing. Freedom comes at a cost. The cost of self-governance and the cost of you are the one who has to make the decisions and you live with the consequences. When you give freedom to people, they can make both good choices and bad choices. And the freedom comes with the price that we pay for the bad choices we make.
Starvation. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So this increased productivity also meant that fewer people needed to work in agriculture in order to feed the population. To put this in perspective, in 1520, 80% of the English population worked the land. By 1800, only 36% of adult male laborers were working in agriculture, and by 1850, that percentage had dropped to 25. This meant that when the factories started humming, there were plenty of workers to hum along with them, especially child laborers.
Again, child laborers, keep in mind, as we mentioned earlier, children worked throughout human history. And actually, once productivity of society went up, only then we could afford to think about child labor and acting against it. So we're blaming capitalism here for solving the issue that existed throughout history.
So far, all this sounds pretty good, right? I mean, except for the child.
But somebody smart and intelligent like the presenter should know that. He should know better.
Labor, who wouldn't want more, cheaper food? Yeah, well, not so fast. One of the ways the British achieved all this agricultural productivity was through the process of enclosure, whereby landlords would reclaim and privatize fields that for centuries had been held in common by multiple tenants. This increased agricultural productivity, but it also impoverished many tenant farmers, many of whom lost their livelihoods. Okay, for our purposes, capitalism is also a cultural system rooted in the need of private investors to.
How conveniently, when we talk about a system that is applied all the way from the United States through Europe to Japan, of course with certain levels of governmental intrusion, how we see present and sometimes fix on some very particular moment of time, let's say in England or in France, whatever is more convenient, to present a point as if that point applies to the whole system. How Japan, let's say, is run today, or India, or China, at least the part of China where economic freedom is allowed, they absolutely don't care what happened in Britain 200 years ago.
To turn a profit. So the real change needed here was a change of mind. People had to develop the capitalist values of taking risks and appreciating innovation. And they had to come.
Taking risks? Tell this to the hunter-gatherers when they had to decide whether to attack the tiger or the mammoth, in order to, especially the mammoth, in order to feed the tribe. Tell them that they did not know how to take risks.
come to believe that making an upfront investment in something like a stand machine could pay for itself and then some. One of the reasons that these values developed in Britain was that the people who initially held them were really good at publicizing them. Writers like Thomas Munn, who worked for the English East India Company, exposed people to the idea that the economy was controlled by markets, and other writers popularized the idea that it was human
controlled by markets, and markets are controlled by people. Therefore, the economy is controlled by people. And that sleight of hand, when we start substituting people and hiding the concept behind some other more nebulous terms, is just meant to confuse the public. And it is the people who make the decisions what to buy and how to spend their time, assuming they're living in a relatively free society so that the government or the king doesn't dispose them off like pawns, telling them what to do.
Nature for individuals to participate in markets as rational actors. Even our language changed. The word individuals did not apply to persons until the 17th century. And in the 18th century, a career still referred only to horses' racing lives. Perhaps the most
interestingly, throwing at extraneous facts that bring very little to the discussion but preoccupy the mind of the listener so that the listener can't actually focus and follow on the logic of the presentation itself.
Important idea that was popularized in England was that men and women were consumers as well as producers, and that this was actually a good thing because the desire to consume manufactured goods could spur economic growth. The main spur to trade, or rather to industry and ingenuity, is the
to put it in a more clear words, being useful to others spurs economic growth.
Exorbitant appetite of men, which they will take pain to gratify. So wrote John Kerry, one of capitalism's cheerleaders in 1695, and in talking about our appetites, he wasn't
cheerleader. That's those pretty girls who keep up the spirits when they have a sports game. So why do we have to compare a new system and people who write in support of it to cheerleading?
Just talking about food. That doesn't seem radical now, but it sure did back then. So here in the 21st century, it's clear that industrial capitalism, at least for now, has won. Sorry, buddy, but you gave it a good run. You didn't know about Stalin. But capitalism isn't without its problems or its critics, and there were certainly lots of shortcomings.
Let's see if he will bring something which is particularly only pertinent to capitalism and cannot be found in the other systems. If it can be found in the other systems, therefore, it is not capitalism to blame about it. Let's find out.
To industrial capitalism in the 19th century. Working conditions were awful, days were
awful working condition, excellent. So, were they better in feudalism, slavery, or prehistoric times?
Long, arduous, and monotonous. Workers lived in conditions that people...
Actually, that's the one thing that not necessarily capitalism, but industrialization brought, and that's monotonous work as opposed to the farm work, where you could follow the cycles through the year, at least in the regions with temperate climate. Once you had industrialization, if you go to work in a factory, then yes, every day looks like the same. But the very same thing applied also to those worker paradise areas, let's say the USSR, where work was just as monotonous, but at least people weren't getting paid.
People living in the developed world today would associate with abject poverty. One way that workers responded to these conditions was by organizing into labor unions. Another response was in many cases purely theoretical. Socialism, most famously Marxian socialism. I should probably point out here that socialism is an imperfect opposite to capitalism, even though the two are often juxtaposed. Capitalism's defenders like to point out that it's natural, meaning that if left to our own devices, humans would construct economic relationships that resemble capitalism. Socialism, at least in its modern incarnations, makes fewer pretenses toward being an expression of human nature. It's the result of human choice and human planning. So socialism...
But the thing is here, imagine a society where people are left to make their own choices, and that's what brings a market. Some people make good choices, some people make bad choices, but usually people, up to a point, leave the results of their choices. Now, when you have planned system, we no longer have that choice the way we have in a freer society. Instead, you have somebody or somebody's planning for everyone else, which first assumes that they know what they're doing, or assumes that they can adequately address the needs of millions of people. Let's keep in mind that the collective expertise of million people vastly outmatches the expertise of any single expert. And this is a pitfall that has been raised by others, including some very great minds, which we can talk about later, that mistake that people who may be very qualified in a field, but they still are not a good match for the task they're trying to undertake, which is to predict the needs and how to meet them, the needs of a large group of people.
Capitalism as an intellectual construct began in France. How'd I do, Stan?
Okay, cut the comedy. Let's get to the chase.
The border between Egypt and Libya. There were two branches of socialism in France, utopian and revolutionary. Utopian socialism is often associated with Comte de Saint-Simon and Charles Fourier, both of whom rejected revolutionary action after having seen the disaster of the French Revolution. Both were critical of capitalism, and while Fourier is usually a punchline in history classes because he believed that in his ideal socialist world the seas would turn to lemonade, he was right that human beings have desires that go beyond.
Oh, it would be so nice in an intellectual discussion if we could get rid of the jabs and those not so funny points and focus on the few salient issues that define a problem.
On basic self-interest and that we aren't always economically rational actors. The other French socialists were the revolutionaries, and they saw the French Revolution, even its violence, in a much more positive light. The most important of these revolutionaries was Auguste Blanqui, and we associate a lot of his ideas with communism, which is a term that he used. Like the utopians, he criticized capitalism, but he believed that it could only be overthrown through violent revolution by the working classes. However, while Blanqui thought that
So imagine the audacity to violently change the life of people, meaning that they are not willing to have their life changed. So not only you think you know better than others, you know so much better than others that their opinion and their values do not matter.
The workers would come to dominate a communist world. He was an elitist, and he believed that workers could never on their own overcome their superstitions and their prejudices in order to throw off bourgeois oppression. And that brings us to Karl Marx, whose ideas and beard cast a shadow over most of the 20th century. Oh, it's time for the open letter?
Oh, well, anyway, as promised, we'll
An open
have
letter
watch
to
the whole
Karl
video.
Marx's beard. But first, let's see what's in the secret compartment today. Oh, robots? Stanbots? 2 Stanbots, one of them female. Now I own all the means of production. You're officially useless to me, Stan. Now turn the camera off. Turn the I'm gonna have to get up and turn the camera off. Stanbot, go turn the camera off. Hey there, Karl Marx's beard. Wow, you are intense. Karl Marx, these days there are a lot of young men who think beards are cool. Beard lovers, if you will. Those aren't beards, they're glorified milk mustaches. I mean, I haven't shaved for a couple weeks, Karl Marx, but I'm not claiming a beard. You don't get a beard by being lazy, you get a beard by being a committed revolutionary. That's why hardcore Marxists are literally known as bearded Marxists. These days, that's an insult. But you know what,
so
Karl
far
Marx,
you're
when I look
saying
back at
nothing.
history, I prefer the bearded communists. Let's talk about some communists who didn't have beards. Mao Zedong, Pol Pot, Kim Jong-il, Joseph freaking Stalin with his face caterpillar. So yeah, Karl Marx's beard, it's my great regret to inform you that there are some paltry beards trying to take up the class struggle these days. Best wishes, John Green. Although he's often considered the father of communism because he co-wrote the Communist Manifesto, Marx was above all a philosopher and a historian. It's just that unlike most philosophers and historians, he advocated for revolution. His greatest work, Das Kapital, sets out to explain the world of the 19th century and his...
Interestingly, if you try to read this work, you go for the first several dozens of pages, actually, when he argues in great length that all kinds of labor are fungible, thus indistinguishable from each other, because he was imagining that all factory workers can be just moved around. And that approach ignores all highly specialized form of labor, and especially the extreme cases when you have professionals that are one of a kind where it comes to offering services. And these people are not that few and far between if you think that all areas of science and medicine, and some nowadays even in coding, you could have only 1 or 2 experts in the field who could render a particular service. And if these people choose not to render that service, there is no way how to obtain it whatsoever because nobody else has the requisite skill for that. So treating labor as fungible, while actually it is not nearly as simple, presents a big issue with Marx's initial postulate, initial idea based on which he started there building his whole pyramid of assumption on a fault basis. So you have a wrongful initial assumption that, of course, can't bring anything better as a later result.
Historical and philosophical terms. Marx's thinking is deep and dense, and we're low on time, but I want to introduce one of his ideas, that of class struggle. So for Marx, the focus isn't on the class, it's on the struggle. Basically,
in general, the big lie that modern day mutations of Marxism bring to modern life presents that the human interaction, especially in a highly complex functioning civil society, are a zero-sum game. And these people today present that men and women, the relationship between them is a zero-sum game, which is not. Similarly, they are trying to put race relations as a zero-sum game, which is absolutely not when you have a market economy, because you are much better off if everyone around you is productive and doing as well as possibly can, in which case they produce the maximum of goods and services that you can use, and also if they get paid for what they are providing, then they can become clients to you. So that whole class struggle is based on the scarcity mentality, where life is a zero-sum game, and therefore if you gain something, you only have gained it because you took it from me. And that's extremely short-sighted and completely ignores the effects of economic activity.
Marx believed that classes don't only struggle to make history, but that the struggle is what makes classes into themselves. The idea is that through conflict, classes develop a sense of themselves, and without conflict, there is no such thing as class consciousness. So Marx was writing in 19th century England, and there were two classes that mattered: the workers and the capitalists. The capitalists owned most of the factors of production, in this case, land and the capital to invest in factories. The workers just had their labor. So the class struggle here is between...
It is very interesting how proponents of communism, Marxism, and all related ideologies, they like to adjust the time frame, and they pick certain moment of time and say, somehow you happen to have all the money and somehow somebody else doesn't, therefore you are the oppressed. One is the oppressor, the other is the oppressed, and pretty much things how this is the things how they are, completely ignoring how people come into wealth, how you have to be useful to yourself and others, and how you can put your own money, time, effort, education, expertise to invest in something. Watch, actually earlier he mentioned investment, but now that's kind of completely ignored. So all that owners and people who have nothing is not some fixed thing in time that sets the stage forever, and therefore unless we fight against each other, things will never change. Keep in mind, capitalism is known to be the system that has the highest rate of upward mobility, which also means downward mobility as well. So you can only attain an economic state if you are sufficiently useful to others over a long period of time.
Between capitalists who want labor at the lowest possible price and the workers who want to be paid as much as possible for their work. There are two key ideas that underlie this theory of class struggle. First, Marx believed that production, or work, was the thing that gave life material meaning. Second is that we are by nature social animals. We work together, we collaborate, we are more efficient when we share resources. Marx's criticism of capitalism is that capitalism replaces this egalitarian collaboration with conflict, and that means that it isn't a natural system after all. And by arguing that capitalism actually isn't consistent with human nature, Marx sought to empower the workers. That's a lot more attractive than Blanqui's elitist socialism, and while purportedly Marxist states like the USSR usually abandon worker empowerment pretty quickly, the idea of protecting our collective interest remains powerful. That's where we'll leave it for now, lest I start reading from the Communist Manifesto. But ultimately,
empowering workers. Just one thing to point out: when it comes to empowering anybody, if somebody comes and promises to empower you, that person usually has something else in mind. The only way for you to get, quote, empowered is to improve your own position by being useful to yourself and others. Or in case of when society is not stable enough, then you may try to do that by force. But if somebody comes and wants to, quote, empower you, usually they are not telling you the full story, or they have some future interest in you. They expect somehow to be paid back. Keep in mind, even when they call themselves Marxists, they still act under capitalism, under capitalist principles. They're making an investment only because they hope that they will get a better return on that investment. And in that case, the investment is you.
Socialism has not succeeded in supplanting capitalism as its proponents had hoped. In the United States, at least, socialism has become something of a dirty word.
That's a lie, and he knows it. Actually, if you look at colleges, universities, and most of the schools, socialism by far not a dirty word. Now, America or the American flag may be dirty words here and there, depending on in which state you are, but no, socialism is not by far being rejected the way how he claims. And as somebody who has 10 million views on that movie, I just have no choice, but I have to call him out on that.
Industrial capitalism certainly seems to have won out, and in terms of material well-being and access to goods and services for people around the world, that's probably a good thing. You keep falling over,
So why don't you just admit it? Yes, capitalism brought levels of well-being to the human population not seen in the past. Can you just acknowledge one thing without turning into a jab?
Great bit, but a very flimsy one. Actually, come to think of it, you're more of an 8-bit. But how and to what extent we use socialist principles to regulate free markets remains an open question, and one that is answered very differently in, say, Sweden than in the United States. And this, I would argue, is where Marx still matters. Is capitalist...
So how can class struggle, if we take his own words, matters in regulating society? If we look at regulation the way we're talking about, let's say, regulating traffic. Why do you regulate traffic? In order to improve traffic and in order to allow people to get even more from what traffic, if unregulated, was going to offer. Do we here regulate capitalism in order to give people even more than what capitalism wants to offer? Because if we are saying that Marx comes into play, and keep in mind he himself defined Marxism as class struggle, therefore we are resting on the assumption that the economic relationship is a zero-sum game, and therefore in a functioning economy where people are productive, somehow we have winners and losers.
Competition natural and good, or should there be systems in place to check it for the sake of our collective well-being? Should we band together to provide health care for the sick or pensions for the old? Should governments run businesses? And if so, which ones? The mail delivery?
Okay. Universal healthcare, actually that's interesting. That is the most famous fascist party in the world had that on their platform, universal healthcare. They also offered universal education, taking care of the elderly. You should look it up before you're calling other people names, for example. But what is important when we have a discussion and when people gloss over topics that are very deep and the devil is in the details, whether it is education, whether it is healthcare, or some other things that sound good, never allow people to gloss over and mention 3 separate topics in one sentence and then move on, leaving those topics undefined and without them responding in detail what they mean and at what cost.
Business, the airport security business, the education business, those are the places.
Interesting, the education business. If we ask, let's say, at the moment the United States, which is a 330 million people country, and overwhelmingly people believe that the school system is not as good as it should be, and it is government run.
Where industrial capitalism and socialism are still competing, and in that sense at least, the struggle continues. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.
Thank you for presenting. And he says some things on the spot, but unfortunately, for somebody who has 10 million views and presents it as a crash course, I would get rid of all those unwarranted jobs, and I will get rid of the lies of omission, and definitely will not be bringing child labor or the risk at the workplace, provided that they existed in all prior systems and have nothing to do with capitalism. And with that, thank you for watching.